Okay, so this video is going to be all about the exchange of matter between a cell and its environment. And we're going to be focusing on basically what kinds of atoms an organism needs in order to survive. And the whole question here is, how do cells get the things they need in order to do their job and in order to maintain homeostasis? So before we get into how they get those things, we want to talk about what things do cells need. Well, basically, what cells need is a variety of organic compounds. You can see that word right here, organic compounds. And these compounds could also be described as molecules. A molecule is anything that is made up of many different atoms. So there's lots of atoms put together into this molecule. And in fact, these are sometimes called macromolecules because they're actually made out of many smaller molecules that are then joined together. So the first one we want to talk about is carbohydrates. So a carbohydrate includes many different types. Basically, the largest kind of carbohydrate is something called a polysaccharide. Now, a polysaccharide is the polymer of this group of compounds. Polymer means it's made up of many different parts, and you can see those in this picture. Each of these little six-sided shapes, each of these little hexagons, represents a single sugar that's been strung together into this polysaccharide, sometimes called a complex sugar or complex carbohydrate. Now, each polysaccharide is made up of many disaccharides. Each disaccharide is two sugars, one right there and one right there, connected together. And each disaccharide is composed of two monosaccharides, just one sugar. This is the smallest piece of a carbohydrate. And because it's the smallest piece, we call it a monomer. So monomer is like one unit of a carbohydrate, and polymer is many units connected together. Now, we also want to notice what carbohydrates are made out of. The word carbohydrate gives you a good hint as to what they're made out of. The carbo part of carbohydrate, which we can see right here, stands for carbon, whereas the hydrate part stands for water. So basically, carbohydrates are made out of carbon, letter C, and water, which is made out of hydrogen and oxygen. So it's all about carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen as far as carbohydrates are concerned. So you can make all these different molecules out of just those three atoms. The next important thing that cells need are called lipids. And lipids are going to include a few different important parts. This is one lipid right here, one triglyceride to be specific. And this triglyceride is going to be composed of three different fatty acids. Here's 1, 2, 3. If you've watched the video on the cell membrane, then these are going to look kind of familiar. These are similar to the phospholipids that make up the cell membrane. And those three fatty acids are going to be connected together by a glycerol. Now, just like a carbohydrate, lipids are comprised of three different kinds of atoms: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. In these pictures, all the black part, this string, is all carbon. These are hydrogens off to the side, and then these red atoms are oxygen. So you can see you need a lot of carbon, a lot of hydrogen, and just a little bit of oxygen to make a lipid. Next up are the proteins. Proteins are made up of a monomer called the amino acid. Amino acids look just like this. It's two carbons, two oxygens, and then the most important thing that amino acids have is they also are made out of nitrogen. And a string of amino acids, one right after the other, is called a peptide, or sometimes called a polypeptide. It means the same thing. And when you put all these amino acids together, you create a protein. And you've already learned, if you've looked at the cell membrane, about enzyme proteins and cell membrane proteins, and so you know that proteins do many different jobs inside the cell. The next thing you need to know about is nucleic acids. Nucleic acids come in two different types, RNA and DNA. We're not going to worry about what they do too much just yet. You'll learn way too much about what they do later on. But you should already know that DNA is the genetic material that's passed on from parents to children, to their offspring. DNA molecules and RNA molecules are both comprised of monomers called nucleotides. And nucleotides, just like the other ones, have carbon, they have hydrogen, they have oxygen. They also have nitrogen, and they also have a little bit of phosphorus in there too. And then lastly, your body also needs high energy compounds. And basically these high energy compounds are ATP. All right? And ATP is actually a nucleotide, which we just talked about 2 seconds ago. Nucleotides also make up DNA and RNA. And it's a nucleotide that has some phosphate groups attached. And so these are made out of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen, and once again, they have phosphorus as well. And it's the phosphorus that's really important because that's where the high energy is stored. All right, so this leads us to a basic idea that what the things cells need are basically just these 6 atoms. They need carbon, they need hydrogen, they need oxygen, they need nitrogen, they need phosphorus, and one that we didn't really mention, but one that's used in proteins occasionally, is sulfur. And if you have all those things, you can make every single molecule that's essential to life. All right, and one of the things that is most important to life is water. And water can provide the hydrogen and the oxygen that is so important. And also water provides a solvent. So when we look at this picture, you can see we've got water in this image. The red sphere right here is the oxygen, and these white parts are the hydrogens. Now, water is a polar molecule. Now, it's polar because it has a slight charge. It has a slight positive charge by the hydrogens, and it has a slight negative charge by the oxygens. Now, I don't know if you remember this, but opposite charges attract each other. So that means the slight negative charge of this oxygen is attracted to the slight positive charge of this hydrogen. They pull each other together, and they form a little bit of a bond. It's not a super strong bond, but it's a little bit of a bond, a little connection called a hydrogen bond. And because water readily forms these hydrogen bonds, when you put something into water, water will actually usually pull that solvent or that solute apart and dissolve it. And so this is what dissolving something looks like. This is a big old block of salt, NaCl. You've got negatively charged and positively charged atoms in here. The chlorine is the green negatively charged one, and the blue one is the sodium, which is positively charged. And when you put that into water, the polar water molecules want to go and be attracted to each of these negative and positively charged sodium and chlorine. And so they rip them apart. Those things get surrounded by water molecules, as you can see right here. This negatively charged chlorine is surrounded by water. And that's what leads it to being dissolved. So because water is so good at dissolving stuff, it's the perfect thing to keep inside a cell, because you can put all kinds of things, salts and proteins and sugars and all of that can be dissolved inside of the cell and carried around by water. And so all of these things that living things need come to it via a cycle. Now you guys are probably familiar with, for example, the water cycle. The fact that when you drink water, that water isn't destroyed by your body, and that water actually gets used by you for a short time and then passes out of you, and it goes into the environment, and then it kind of goes through this process where the water evaporates up into the clouds and it rains back down, and then you get to drink it again. And so there's this constant rotation of water through the environment. Water's never used up. It just moves from one place to another. And this is true of all of these atoms that are used in living things: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. One really good example of this is the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is the explanation of how carbon moves through living things. So for example, carbon naturally occurs as CO2 in the atmosphere. And plants, when they do photosynthesis, will pull that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and use it and put it into sugars inside of the plant. Now those carbons and oxygens are not destroyed, they're just combined with other things. And when that plant gets eaten by a cow, for example, or when the plant dies, that carbon goes into the soil or it goes into the cow. And then that cow can be used by this human, and the human can eat it, and then they get the carbon. And then when the human eats it, or even when the cow eats the plant, they're going to release carbon dioxide back up into the atmosphere, and the cycle continues. So you need to know that for every single one of these atoms, whether it's nitrogen or phosphorus or sulfur, each one has a cycle like this, because there's no place that you can go and get brand new phosphorus. There's only so much phosphorus on the earth, and so it has to be constantly recycled. One last thing to understand about how living cells get things from the environment is that everything a cell gets from its environment, it has to absorb. So if you're a cell in the human body, you are probably pretty close to a blood vessel, and that blood vessel is providing you with everything you need to live, whether it's sugar or oxygen or some other mineral. And in order to absorb that, the cell has to pull that sugar or oxygen through its membrane. And this is actually what keeps cells from being really big. If you've ever wondered why cells are so small, it's because at some certain point it becomes impossible for a cell to live, because it's just too big. And this is all based on an idea called the surface area to volume ratio. And so if you look at these three cells right here, to calculate the surface area to volume ratio, you first calculate the surface area. So you calculate the area. And you'll notice that each of these is a cubic cell. So each cube is going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sides. And each side is a square. And now this one shows you that this is a square that's 1 millimeter. Of course, no cell would ever be that big, but it's 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter. And so in order to calculate the area of that, you multiply 1 times 1, and you find out that that's a 1 millimeter square side. Now, each side is going to have an area of 1 millimeter. So the total surface area of this cube is 6 square millimeters. And then you want to find out the volume. If you remember from, math class, you know that to find volume, you actually take the 3 different sides, the base of this cube, the height, and you multiply it by the width. So in this case, they're all 1 millimeter again. So you do 1 times 1 times 1. Oh my goodness, it's 1. And you find out that this is 1 cubic millimeter in volume, and you can see that right here. Now the surface area to volume ratio we figure out by taking this surface area, which is 6 millimeters, and dividing it by the volume, which is 1 millimeter cubed. And we find out that this has a surface area to volume ratio of 6. In other words, you have 6 square millimeters of volume for just 6 square millimeters of surface area for just 1 square millimeter of volume. And that means you've got a lot of cell membrane for just a small amount of cell. Whereas this guy over here has a huge amount of cell with a relatively small amount of cell membrane. So he's not able to actually feed all that cell.